In 1969, mankind took a giant leap forward and reached new heights by landing on the moon. Or did we? Yes, we did. But what if I told you we had actually been there 134 years prior? That one was definitely fake. And what exactly did they fake? Bat people. Yes, bat people on the moon. Okay, here's how it went down. In August of 1835, a New York newspaper called The Sun ran a series of articles claiming to report the discovery of life on the moon. And we're not talking about little green men or Ewoks, no. We're talking about unicorns, tailless beavers, and bat people. You know, your typical moon creatures. And because this was 1835, you couldn't just Google it to fact check. You were at the mercy of what you read. On Friday, August 21st, 1835, a teaser came out in the New York Sun. It read, "We have just learnt from an eminent publisher in this city that Sir John Herschel at the Cape of Good Hope has made some astronomical discoveries of the most wonderful description by means of an immense telescope of an entirely new principle." John Herschel, a world-renowned astronomer, and his assistant, Dr. Andrew Grant, allegedly sent these notes to the Edinburgh Journal of Science, but the Sun got wind of it and decided to share it with all of New York. The first full entry of the series was published Tuesday, August 25th, 1835. It was titled, "Great Astronomical Discoveries Lately Made by Sir John Herschel at the Cape of Good Hope from the Supplement to the Edinburgh Journal of Science." A mouthful of a title. The article announced that they were so excited to share with the public and the whole civilized world these recent discoveries that would forever change life as they knew it. The first entry described in extensive detail Herschel's great apparatus, the telescope. Get your mind out of the gutter. They thought that if readers understood how amazing the telescope was, they wouldn't doubt what Herschel was able to see with it. They were preparing their audience. They described the telescope as being 24 feet in diameter, which is absolutely enormous, even for a great apparatus such as his. For reference, the Hubble telescope is only 14 feet in diameter, and the largest telescope in the entire world, the Gran Telescopio Canarias, is 34 feet in diameter. To have a 24-foot diameter telescope in 1835 would be bananas. It apparently weighed about 7 tons and had a hydrogen-oxygen microscope. The microscope projected the image from the telescope onto a canvas screen, which allowed crystal clear magnification of very distant objects. Besides, the telescope could allegedly magnify up to 42,000 times. In the second entry on August 26, they described the moon's landscape, still laying the groundwork for the really crazy stuff. And what they saw was a far cry from the barren gray rock we're familiar with today. No, according to them, the moon was a lush landscape covered with red flowers that looked like poppies. There were large forests of fir and yew trees and white sand beaches surrounded by green marble. Anyone else packing a suitcase right now? It was when they adjusted the lens on the telescope and took a closer look that things got wild. In the shadow of the forest was a herd of quadrupeds resembling very small bison. They had one horn and a flap covering their eyes to protect them from the apparent extreme differences in light and dark on the moon. And if you think that sounds weird, you should probably buckle up. But before things got too juicy, they were forced to take a break because the lunar atmosphere became cloudy. But it wasn't forever. Within a few days, both the Earth's atmosphere and the lunar atmosphere were clear, and they saw everything. Crystal mountains, large lakes with volcanic islands, palm trees with flowers instead of coconuts, excessively fertile land, melon trees, and of course, more animals, because as we've established, the moon was just teeming with life. There were more bison-like creatures, but these were slightly larger, flocks of birds, little reindeer, elk, moose, horned bears, and a bipedal beaver with no tail. All in all, that day, they discovered 9 mammal species and 5 oviparous species, or egg-laying species. And the lunar beaver was especially exciting. Think Mr. Beaver in Narnia. The beavers made huts instead of dams, and the huts had smoke coming out of them, so presumably they were intelligent enough to use fire, and they walked on 2 legs and carried their young much like a human would. But the 4th installment was really the crown jewel of the series. Once again, they started by describing the new landscapes they discovered. They saw bright red mountains with veins of virgin gold. They also saw something else. Several groups of winged creatures ascended from the base of a cliff and landed on an open plain. Here's the thing. These winged creatures looked an awful lot like humans. They were 4 feet tall and had copper-colored fur all over their bodies except for their faces, and their faces were described as a slight improvement upon that of the large orangutan. They had beards and hair on their heads that was darker than the fur on the rest of their bodies, and, of course, bat wings. Why not? And because the astronomers had made such an amazing discovery, they had to give it a proper Latin name. They went with Vespertilio homo, man-bat. The valley where they lived was dubbed the Ruby Colosseum. The bat people weren't just flying around aimlessly. They lived in colonies and flew around the moon's valleys, doing things like, let's say, engaging in lunar courtship, under the romantic glow of the Earthlight. I guess they couldn't draw the curtains to protect from the peeping toms with a telescope 239,000 miles away. The 5th installment of the series described multiple oceans, 7 seas, and many small bodies of water. There were also outcroppings that the astronomers struggled to name because there were no similar features on Earth. After describing the landscape in detail once again, they adjusted their telescope, and what did they see? I'll give you one guess. And if your guess wasn't a 100-foot-high temple made of sapphire, you'd be wrong. Yes, there was a giant temple comprised of 6-feet-wide columns, all made of sapphire or something similar found only on the moon. The roof was made of golden metal that mimicked the look of flames, and in the middle was a sphere made of clouded copper. The astronomers speculated the meaning of this temple, asking, did they by this record any past calamity of their world, or predict any future one of ours? The 6th entry came out almost a week after the first. Not far from the temple, the astronomers had discovered another type of the bat people, but these were larger, had lighter colored fur, and were described as an improved variety of Vespertilio homo. The investigations ended with the astronomers royally screwing up. They forgot to lower the telescope and place it horizontally, so when the sun came up the next day, the lens reflected the light and caught a bunch of stuff on fire. They ordered a rush repair job, and everything was back in working order within a week. The issue was that the moon was no longer in an observable position, so Herschel decided to start studying Saturn. To which I say, how could you possibly think about Saturn when you've just discovered bat people on the moon? Anyway, when the moon moved back into an observable position, Herschel was way too wrapped up in Saturn's rings to refocus himself. So Dr. Grant and the other assistants decided to take a peek at the moon themselves, and they saw yet another, even more impressive group of the bat people, and these were said to produce art. As the pièce de résistance, Dr. Grant said basically that he didn't want to steal Herschel's thunder anymore, and that everyone should read more about the bat people in Herschel's upcoming authenticated scientific account. Thus, as all good things must come to an end, the series concluded. So, how on the moon did this all happen? You would think that the public would read stories like this, say, no way, and move on. But that's not what happened. People were obsessed with this series. They read it like the 1835 equivalent of early 2000s Harry Potter fanfiction. Because in 1835, newspapers were everything. They were people's primary source of information, entertainment, and even social interaction. But newspapers were originally aimed at the middle and upper classes because reading them was fairly expensive. But the 19th century was ripe for change, and the invention of the steam-powered printing press suddenly made newspapers really cheap to produce. Enter the penny press. Penny papers were printed daily and sold for, you guessed it, a penny. The Sun was a new up-and-coming penny paper. It wasn't flashy, it didn't have quite the tabloid reputation we think of today, but it was ambitious. It was trying to push the boundaries of journalism and, well, get attention. And how does a newspaper get attention in 1835? It doesn't just report the news, it makes it. As we know, the articles were written as if they were the findings of real astronomers, Sir John Herschel and his assistant, Dr. Andrew Grant, both of whom supposedly made these discoveries while using a powerful, gigantic new telescope in South Africa. But Dr. Andrew Grant was 100% definitely not a real scientist. In fact, he wasn't a real person at all. Not only that, but John Herschel wasn't even in South Africa when these alleged discoveries were made, and his powerful, all-seeing, giant apparatus? Just a regular telescope. Eventually, people asked one too many questions, and the Sun was forced to admit they had made it all up. but they never printed a formal retraction. This was only a few weeks after they published it, but the story had already spread all over the world, and other newspapers started joining in on the joke and teasing the Sun. And when the news broke that it wasn't real, people weren't even really mad, just a little disappointed they couldn't catch a flight to the moon for their summer vacation. And you might think that a scandal like this would cause their sales to plummet, but they didn't. They skyrocketed, and the Sun was cemented as a successful daily newspaper. So, who even wrote these articles? They were published anonymously, but 5 years later, a man named Richard Adams Locke came forward and said that he had written the series as a satire. This caused a bit of a stir and caught the attention of one Edgar Allan Poe. Yes, that Edgar Allan Poe. The story with Poe is a little tricky. He said that not only were the moon articles a hoax, they were plagiarism. He had written a very similar article that had run in the Southern Literary Messenger just 2 months before the moon hoax articles ran. It was titled The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall, which tells the story of a man who flies to the moon on a balloon and sees unimaginable sights. And you'll never guess who the editor was. Richard Adams Locke. Poe's story was supposed to run in multiple installments, but when the Sun stole his thunder, he discontinued it. 9 years later, though, he was still angry, so he published a story about a man named Monk Mason who had crossed the Atlantic in 3 days using a gas balloon. Because if there's one thing Poe's gonna do, it's get revenge. It was sensational and successful, but within a couple days, the public got word that he had only written the story to spite Richard Adams Locke and the Sun, and readers were no longer interested in picking it up. And this ongoing feud between Locke and Poe inspired sci-fi author Jules Verne more than once. He mentioned the Great Moon Hoax and Poe's story in his book From the Earth to the Moon in 1865. And Poe's story got him interested in balloon travel, and he ended up writing Around the World in 80 Days and 5 Weeks in a Balloon. So, what do we take away from all this? For one, the Great Moon Hoax of 1835 shows us just how easily we can be duped when we want to believe in something, even when there's overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and even when it goes against logic and reason. Fantastic stories surround us every day, and it can be easy to get caught up in the mystery of what we see, hear, and read. Whether it's bat people on the moon or Avril Lavigne being body swapped with a girl named Melissa, take a second to ask yourself, does this sound too good or too weird to be true? Because it probably is.